Nous allons procéder au deuxième panel immédiatement. Nous allons entendre une mise à jour des cas et des individus également qui ont été touchés par les enjeux soulevés par Alex. Ce panel est présidé par Hilary Holmes. Son titre en anglais, c'est Campaigner, Human Rights and National Security.
In the face of all the rhetoric around the so-called war on terror, the ramping up of fears and the call for more powers, as well, thankfully, the call for more restraint, it's important that we start today with some of the stories of the people directly affected. Governments have not only the right, but the responsibility to respond to concerns about threats and attacks, and to protect their citizens, but not at any cost. As Alex has made abundantly clear in his opening remarks, government actions must conform with international human rights law, including protections against torture and arbitrary arrest and detention. Real security must ultimately be based on advancing the human rights of everyone. We cannot pursue the security of some at the expense of others. As you will hear from this morning's panelists, that failure to set out an inclusive framework for our security has had devastating consequences. The fallout for them, their families, communities, and clients points not to exceptional mistakes, but rather to a worrying pattern that leaves both them and potentially others at risk. These cases date back 10 years or more, but they are not in the past. They remain unresolved. No accountability, no redress, no substantial change to the attitudes, policies, and practices that targeted them and continue to fail us all. With all the inquiries, studies, debates, and court decisions, it shouldn't still be that way. But today there is no guarantee that what happened and continues to happen to them will not happen to others. And every single one of the people sitting beside me at this table is fighting to change that. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists in turn. They're going to speak in the order that they're sitting here. They'll speak for about 10 minutes each, and then we should have a fair bit of time to open the floor to questions. There are a couple of mics out there. So we're going to start with Abdullah Al Malki. Abdullah Al Malki was illegally detained, interrogated, brutally and repeatedly tortured, and kept in abysmal prison conditions for about 2 years in Syria. The Yakabuchi Commission of Inquiry found that Canadian officials sent inaccurate information to Syria, falsely linking Abdullah to terrorism. It also found that Abdullah was interrogated and tortured in Syria on questions and information that were sent to Syria by the RCMP and other Canadian agencies. It blamed Canadian officials for their role in his prolonged detention and torture. It also confirmed that Abdullah was indeed severely tortured in Syria. The Commission found that Abdullah was falsely labeled as a threat to national security. In 2009, the Canadian Parliament voted in favor of an official apology, compensation, and to correct the misinformation that was spread nationally and internationally about Abdullah and his family. But the Canadian government has yet to implement any part of that motion. Dr. Stephen Toop, who was the fact finder for the O'Connor Commission, wrote in his report, "Of all the testimony I heard, Mr. Al Malki received the most intense pain and suffering. Mr. Al Malki was especially badly treated and for an extended period. Since Abdullah's return to Canada, his thoughts have been with the people he saw in the Syrian jails. He is determined to do whatever he possibly can to put a spotlight on the crime of torture, help the people detained without due process, hold officials complicit in torture accountable, and have the system that got him into Syrian torture chambers reformed. Abdullah is a husband, a father, an entrepreneur, and an engineer. He was born in Damascus, grew up in Ottawa, graduated from Carleton University, and still lives in Ottawa." Abdullah. I think you have a PowerPoint you want to use as well? Yep. Do you want to move it to the table, or do you want to stand?
Just stand.
You going to stand? Okay. Sure.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Hilary. Over 12 years ago, I landed at Damascus airport, almost immediately detained, taken to a place called Fara, Palestine, which is internationally known as a torture house, due to its brutal interrogation methods and torture. Once I was in that center, it didn't take very long. in a very short period of time. Things got from bad to worse. And I found myself on the ground, facing the floor, with my legs 90 degrees in the air, arms behind my back, in this position, which is called fala, and they started, very fit men, hammering the soles of my feet with electric cable. They whipped mainly the soles of my feet, but they whipped everywhere else. These very fit men, they were whipping with all the power they had, that they get tired very quickly, and they take turns. The ones who they were not whipping, they were kicking me all around my body. This lasted from a Friday afternoon till late afternoon till a Saturday morning the next day. And during that interrogation, during that torture interrogation, they wanted me to confess that I was linked to Al-Qaeda, that I was a high-ranking member of Al-Qaeda. They kept on repeating that I was wanted in Canada. They wanted to know what plot I was part of. And the torture kept on going on and on till I fainted at the end. Every now and then, they were pouring cold water on my feet, ordering me to stand, jog in place, and then they would put me back in that position and continue the torture. I learned later that they do this so that the blood keeps on circulating in my feet, control the swelling, and I would keep on feeling the pain. Unknown to me at that time, and I learned more than 6 years later, that the RCMP had, before I went to Syria, labeled and spread internationally, shared internationally about me that I was an important, they falsely claimed that I was an important member of Al-Qaeda. They sent to Syria, among other countries, that I was suggesting that I was an imminent threat to the national security and public safety of Canada. The RCMP also labeled myself and my family as being Islamic extremist individuals suspected of being linked to Al-Qaeda, and they shared it nationally and internationally to a good number of countries. They also said that I was an Al-Qaeda recruitment officer. Well, the Acapulco inquiry conclusion about all these accusations were they were inflammatory, inaccurate, and lacking investigative foundation. Well, not only this. From documents that I obtained under Access to Information Act, RCMP-owned documents, when you put two documents together, you get a terrifying picture. The RCMP, on the exact same day that they sent to Syria, suggesting to them that I was an imminent threat to the national security and public safety of Canada, on that exact same day, that's what they sent internationally, Syria and other countries. On that exact same day, their own internal document said, O Division Task Force are presently finding it difficult to establish anything on him other than the fact that he is an Arab running around. I'll leave it to you to make the conclusion about this kind of agency, which is now asking for more powers. Well, there are more than 1 million Canadians from Arab descent. So all of us are imminent threat. This is another type of torture that I was subjected to using a car tire, being squeezed and yanked in a car tire. This caused permanent damage to my number of areas in my body. Other than the position itself is extremely painful, and to be put in that position for an extended period of time. They were also whipping me with electric cable, mainly on the soles of my feet, but also my head, my arms, my genitals were an easy target, and they spared none of it. This is another type of torture that I was subjected to, among others, notably after RCMP liaison officer went to Syria, and with the help and presence of the Canadian ambassador to Syria, met with the Syrian military intelligence director, the very agency that was holding me, interrogating me, and torturing me. Well, after that meeting, I was subjected to a few days of torture, and that was one of the methods they used at that time. While during the first 16 months of imprisonment in Syria, I was kept in an underground cell that they call it Arar in Syria. It means grave. Felt, looked, smelled like a grave. It was exactly my arm length wide and 4 fingers, so this is exactly how wide it was, less than 2 meters high and about 185 centimeters deep. Dark, extremely cold in the winter, unbearably hot in the summer. Constant 24/7 torture, physical and mental. Physical because of the physics of the cell. Most basic human needs are challenged to do, go into the washroom, for example. Mental, constant fear of being pulled to a torture chamber for more severe torture. Constantly hearing other people being tortured. Heart sinking every time I heard footsteps outside. Over 16 months of being in that grave. Now, Canada partnership with Syria. While the RCMP, fully knowing, well, other than what they sent before I went to Syria, but while I was in Syria, they kept on sharing information, meeting with my torturers, with their partners, sending questions to the Syrians, fully knowing that was likely the Syrians would torture me to get the answers, but they sent it anyway. I thought you were going to kick me out. CSIS met also with the Syrians. While I was there, met with Syrian intelligence, shared information. External affairs, the embassy, the ambassador, they were facilitating the exchange of information, giving the Syrians the questions and demanding the fruits of the torture, facilitating the meetings for the other government agencies, and notably, in none of these meetings with the Syrian officials, they asked for consular visits. Not a single time. Now, torture is one of the most despicable, dangerous, damaging, destructive crime with dreadful human consequence. If it produces anything, it produces pain, agony, frustration, fear, suffering, anger, international insecurity, and possibly results in laws and policies that curtail basic fundamental human rights. 2 years of grave human rights violations I endured on the hands of Syrian regime, carrying out the work on behalf of the Canadian security agencies. I lost my wife, my kids, and my family for about 2 years. My family lost me, my kids lost me for about 2 years. I lost my business and my career. My life has been stolen. I'll never be physically and mentally the same. But has been also been 13 years of cascaded oppression. The Canadian government is using everything in its power to delay justice. It is ignoring its own parliament, it's ignoring its own inquiry that it called the internal inquiry findings, the findings of the recommendations of Parliamentary Committee on National Security and Public Safety, UN recommendations, the Parliament own vote on apology, redress, and correcting all the misinformation that was spread about me and my family, nationally and internationally, the government ignoring it all. Whenever I used to travel, and I'll end with this, I got wrapped up. Whenever I used to travel, before all this happened, whenever I boarded a plane back to Canada, I felt rested, comfortable, settled, feeling that I was going back home. Now I feel void in that sense of home, a country where I can be safe in, where I would feel safe in, where I would be treated with justice, equality, respect, and dignity. Worse is when you see that this home country, my country, your country, our kids' home, ignoring all the recent history about police and security agencies' wrongdoings, racism, complicities, from fabricating accusations to false labeling, smearing, complicity in torture, complicity in illegal detention, complicity in illegal interrogation, to partnering with oppressive, repressive, brutal regimes and using national security claim privileges to try to hide it all. To a government that is not willing to right the wrong, nor willing to hold officials accountable, ignoring its national and international obligations, and now is willing and is giving these exact same agencies, these exact same incompetent agencies, more powers, and even worse, more powers without any meaningful oversight whatsoever. It is utterly sad and awfully worrisome and alarming. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abdullah. Next, we'll have Sophie Harcott. Sophie Harcott, a graduate student in public and media relations, became a human rights activist overnight when her husband, Mohammed Harkat, an Algerian refugee, was arrested under a security certificate on December 10th, 2002. And of course, as many of you know, December 10th is International Human Rights Day. Her life was turned upside down and every aspect of her life affected by the arrest of her husband, but refused to be silenced by this injustice. Sophie has traveled extensively across Canada and to the UK to talk about security certificates and granted hundreds of interviews with reporters from around the world about her husband's case. She has been a guest speaker at various universities and conferences for the past 10 years. One of her most memorable events was when she spoke with Jack Layton at a large rally against George Bush in front of 20,000 people in 2004. Sophie also published numerous articles for various papers, as well as Rabble, and worked on a couple of documentaries, including one with Sacha Trudeau and The Secret Trial 5, currently touring the country in various film festivals. And here in Ottawa, that's going to be screening at the Bytown in mid-November, so check the schedule. Go out and see it. She was given a Human Rights Award by CARECAN, now known as the National Council of Canadian Muslims, in 2004. Sophie is determined to fight until justice prevails and her husband, Mohammed, is cleared of all allegations and until security certificates are abolished. Sophie Harcott.
Good morning, bonjour. First, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak. I'm also very thankful to share this panel with these other guests who fight for human rights and justice. For the past 12 years, I've been fighting for my husband, not only because I believe in his innocence, but because I believe in due process, in transparency, and in accountability. For all these years, never once did we ask that he be released, but that he be given a fair and open trial so he can defend himself. It is important, not only for my husband, for all Canadians to know the case against him. Although many years have gone by since his arrest and detention, we have faith that with time, the truth will come out. We have never been afraid of the truth. His life and our families have been ruined by these allegations. Why is CSIS refusing to put it out there? None of the security certificate detainees have ever been afraid to defend themselves. Our nightmare began on December 10, 2002, when my husband was arrested under a security certificate and thrown in jail. Deemed a threat to national security, he was taken away from our family, and we were never given the reasons why. His public counsels kept in the dark. He was given a summary of allegations, every sentence starting with, "We assume, we believe, we think that in the past, present, or future, he may be a presumed terrorist or a so-called sleeper agent." Why? He was never given the evidence. According to the best experts in the world, the concept of a sleeper agent does not exist. Again, according to a government expert, Mohammed is the only sleeper agent in the world who declared his fake passport voluntarily when he entered Canada, something the media never reported or that it is being used against him repeatedly. Mohammed spent 43 months in jail, 1 year in solitary confinement, no outdoor visits for the first 6 months. I remember how he was happy to see the sun and the sky again for the first time after so many months, or feel the breeze on his skin. He was alone in his cell with nothing to read, not even the Quran for the first 4 months. He was alone in his cell with nothing to do but stare at blank walls. He had 1 shower a week for the first few months, no human contact, 2 visits of 20 minutes per week through a thick window. I would wait hours to see him in unbearable conditions. He was treated like an animal. He was never told why. Many times he feared for his safety. He was the longest serving inmate at the Ottawa Provincial Detention Center, and even the other inmates did not understand why he was there. Where do you keep someone with no charge for so long? He was then transferred to Canada's own Guantanamo prison, located on the grounds of the Kingston Penitentiary, a portable unit surrounded by 3 sets of barbed wires built specifically to hold security certificate detainees. The men were not treated the same and were isolated and far from their families. Many nights we cried ourselves to sleep. Then came the day of his release on bail in June of 2006, the day we were all waiting for so many years. At the time, we were willing to do anything to keep him out of prison. It cost us everything. That's the day I became a full-time jailer to my husband and a prisoner in our own home for 3.5 years. The day our family, friends, and supporters had to live around Mo's condition to accommodate his freedom. Many times, Mo offered to go back to jail to spare us the pain and suffering. Imagine a life where you wear a GPS around your ankle 24/7 for 7.5 years. Plug yourself in a wall for 2 hours a day to recharge the battery. My husband could never be left alone in a house or in his backyard. He was supervised at all times. We had 2 surveillance cameras in our home, mail and phone intercepted. All visitors to our home were pre-approved, including our newborn nephew and my 80-year-old grandmother. We were only allowed 3 outings per week of 4 hours each, approved 48 to 96 hours in advance, including all locations we visited and everyone we met. Imagine being followed by 2 to 6 CBSA officers at all times, wearing bulletproof vests, carrying weapons, driving police-style vehicles to do your grocery or park in front of your sister's home during our family's Christmas dinner. Imagine having to share a public washroom or doctor appointment because he can never be left alone. Imagine going to a movie or an event surrounded by officers. Imagine the constant sound of a walkie-talkie following you. Imagine having no more personal space. Imagine being denied attendance to your own 40th birthday party, denied travel to a 10th wedding anniversary, getting your house raided by 16 CBSA officers and 3 sniffing dogs, followed at the grocery, at the restaurant, while on a public bus, followed to your own grandfather's funeral. Imagine getting your new allegation report with the wrong name on top. Imagine what goes on behind closed doors that we don't get to see or hear. Imagine, just imagine, this is happening right here in Canada. For 12 years, we have been dehumanized, humiliated, put into question, even under oath. You testify, you are a liar. You don't testify, you're hiding something. Every word, every movement, every breath put into question, not only Mohammed, but myself and our family and friends. Every aspect of our private lives exposed and scrutinized by the court and the press. It's our words against theirs. I'm fighting a machine, judged by so many who do not know us. Ours was called a marriage of convenience by the court. There is nothing convenient about our struggle. Years of sacrifices, all in the name of justice. In 2007, the Supreme got it right. The security certificate was found unconstitutional. The addition of special advocates did not change anything. Secrecy remained. 2014, Supreme Court got it wrong. Injustice and secrecy are acceptable. The law remains imperfect, but good enough, we were told. We lost so many years of our lives, and the courts are learning along the way how to deal with the challenges of this law, meanwhile on our backs. How is this justice? All original evidence in our case destroyed. Main informant failing his lie detector test and providing untruthful statements leading to false allegations. Solicitor-client calls listened to. Illegal raid at our home on the eve of a hearing. Evidence deriving from torture. I fear for the future, where we are allowed to arrest and detain more individuals based on allegation, association, and uncontested hearsay. I worry about someone's life being ruined by an informant whose credibility and reliability can never be tested, even in secret proceedings where no one would know his name or his identity. I worry about the court that continues to base their decisions on the lowest standard of proof or on the reasonable grounds to believe someone could be a threat. Although I believe there should be laws in place to protect Canadians, we need to assure balance between national security and individuals' rights. I urge our members of Parliament, decision makers, courts, to put an end to secret trials in Canada and a two-tier justice system. Why not use a criminal code? Before making that decision, put yourself in our shoes and ask yourself, would you accept being detained without charge and kept in the dark? Would you accept that process for yourself? Would you fight back? In our last Supreme Court of Canada decision, they admitted being uncomfortable holding secret hearings. Then why are we allowing it to happen in the first place? Now my husband faces deportation to Algeria, where he is at great risk of detention, torture, or death because of the allegations given by our Canadian government. Terrorist is the worst and most damageable label. At the end, we are all humans. We all deserve justice, no matter what our status. I would like to conclude by saying I'm thankful to my family for their unconditional love and support, our committee, our legal team for their dedication and hard work, and for all Canadians who believe in democracy and due process. Fear does not get us anywhere. 12 years ago, I was afraid, but I stood up and I decided to fight back. Secret trials have no place in a democracy. Thank you to my husband, who is my source of inspiration. My husband has always denied the allegation, and he will never admit to something he didn't do or to someone he didn't know. I will be by his side until justice prevails, no matter how long it will take, and until the day he can walk free and clear his name. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. And now we turn to the lawyers. Why are you laughing, Alex? Dennis Edney, originally from Dundee, Scotland, has been a defense lawyer based in Edmonton, Alberta for the past 26 years. Prior to embarking upon a law degree, Dennis had several careers, including owning and operating a trucking and construction business. In 1987, after completing a law degree at the University of Northumbria, England, Dennis began a legal career as a general practitioner. Later, the focus shifted to criminal and human rights law and cases being tried under the new terrorism legislation. He is listed as counsel in various report cases, including appearances before the Supreme Court of Canada. In 2004, Dennis was appointed as foreign attorney consultant by the U.S. Pentagon to participate in the defense of Omar Khadr, a young Canadian detained in Guantanamo Bay. Dennis's work has been recognized through many awards, including co-recipient of the 2008 National Pro Bono Award for his work on Omar Khadr's case, the 2009 Human Rights Medal, awarded by the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia for his work that has helped promote and further human rights, the prestigious Gerald L. Gall Award by the John Humphrey Center for Peace and Human Rights in 2013, and just this year, Dennis was awarded the Winnipeg Citizens Award and the Paul Harris Fellowship for his contribution to global human rights. He has lectured extensively throughout North America and Europe on the rule of law. Dennis Edney.
Good morning. I've been given the unenviable task of providing an overview of the journey of Omar Khadr for the past 12 years. Of course, it's impossible to do justice today, but allow me to make certain comments in the 10 minutes that I have. First of all, I'm a lawyer. And like many of you here today, I believe that the adherence to the rule of law is critical to one's national reputation and one's values. The story of Omar Khadr touches upon the legal to the illegal, from the human to the inhuman. I could simply sum it up by saying that I've never met anyone such as Omar Khadr, who has been so badly treated and so abandoned by so many who should know better. The fact that Omar suffered over 10 years of abuse and torture in that hellhole called Guantanamo Bay from the age of 15 should come as no surprise to any one of us here today. It was in January of 2002 we saw the first shocking images of human beings in rows, in aircraft, hooded and shackled, for transportation across the Atlantic, much as other human beings had been carried in slave ships 400 years earlier. We witnessed the captors humiliating these anonymous human beings and loaded at Guantanamo Bay, crouched in open cages, in orange jumpsuits, all deliberately displayed for the world to see. And for the watching world, which is you and I, no knowledge of international humanitarian conventions was needed to understand that what we were witnessing was unlawful. This was not a manifestation of the Geneva Conventions, nor was it an act of deportation or extradition. It was far worse. It was the unlawful transportation to a world outside the reach of the law, and intended to remain so. And in that world, crimes against humanity were carried out in Guantanamo Bay. And abandoned there was the only youth, a Canadian boy at 15 years of age, Omar Khadr. On Omar's return to Canada almost 2 years ago, the Canadian government classified him as a maximum security risk, both to Canada and to any prison institution where he may be located. It did so in the face of irrefutable evidence, including reports from Guantanamo itself, that he was simply a good kid. Since his arrival in Canada, Omar has been placed in some of the most notorious prisons we know. First of all, he was initially placed in Millhaven Penitentiary, and to greet him as he arrived here, we locked him away in solitary confinement for the first 7.5 months. And then on releasing him into the prison population, an inmate tried to stab him and then put a contract on his life. I was able to use that situation to secure his transfer to a maximum security prison in Alberta, where I live. And on arrival, he was placed on a white supremacist unit, the sole Muslim on a white supremacist unit. And within minutes, he was beaten up. And I recall the urgent calls I received from the correctional services to come and visit him immediately at the prison. And on arrival, I met a very sad and frightened Omar Khadr, who had put his trust in me, in agreeing to enter into a plea bargain, which I persuaded him to take, so that he could return to the safety of the Canada that I had described to him. It was then that I faced the sober reality that not only was I unable to keep him safe in Guantanamo, I was also unable to keep him safe in Canada. Our generation has had the most sophisticated development of international laws, treaties, and conventions the international community has ever known, all stating that human rights abuses will not be tolerated. And those international instruments include the Geneva Conventions, the Convention on Torture, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and many more, all applicable to Omar Khadr, and all denied to him. And as a result, the international consensus reflected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Charter of the United Nations that no one in the future would fall outside the protection of law has been overridden and supplanted by lawlessness. And as a signatory to all these international treaties, Canada has an obligation to protest when they are not being applied to one of its citizens. And yet, it has refused to uphold its human rights obligations when it comes to Omar Khadr. Our Canadian government, by its actions, has demonstrated a shocking, a reckless, and a ruthless disregard for those moral and legal laws that give effect to the idea of fairness. And by doing so, I say to you, it has shown how fragile are the laws and their application that each one of us assume is there to protect us when faced with a government determined to follow a contrary path. These are hard times. In fact, my lengthy legal journey on behalf of Omar has been a sober reminder about the very limits of justice itself. And it also has said something about the apathy of the country I live in. Yet throughout it all, Omar Khadr has retained his humanity. He has turned his prison experience into a monastery and has no animosity towards anyone because he believes that life is more important than death. Notwithstanding that he suffers major health problems and is presently going blind. One would never, or I would never, have envisaged that the history of the new century would encompass the destruction and the distortion of fundamental legal and constitutional principles that have been in place since the 17th century. We appear to have forgotten the lessons of the Star Chamber, where the accused were submitted to torture, to accusations based on secret evidence, heard by a secret court, while being shackled in the extremes of isolation. The worst excesses of the past years should have sounded loud alarms, not the least because of that precise historic parallel to the Star Chamber. And worse, we have bequeathed this social legacy to our children. Our rights are being infringed more and more on every side, and the danger really is that we get used to it. So as I conclude, the story of Omar Khadr is not just about a young boy who was detained and abused and continues to be detained and continues to be abused. His story is also about how we as individuals define ourselves as a society and what each one of us is prepared to stand up for. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis. Paul Champ is a human rights and labor lawyer in Ottawa. Paul has acted as counsel in several important constitutional law cases dealing with fundamental human rights and civil liberties, and regularly represents groups such as Amnesty International and the BC Civil Liberties Association. Paul has defended the human rights of prisoners in the custody of Canadian military in Afghanistan and appeared before the Supreme Court of Canada in Khadr 1 and made submissions to the Abousfian inquiry regarding the torture of 3 Canadians abroad. He was also counsel in Abdelrazik versus the Minister of Foreign Affairs and successfully petitioned the United Nations to remove Mr. Abdelrazik from the UN 1267 list. In 2010, Paul was the recipient of the Reg Robson Civil Liberties Award. In 2013, he was honored by the International Commission of Jurists with the Walter S. Tarnopolsky Human Rights Award for outstanding contributions to domestic and international human rights. Paul Champ.
I want to thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to address you today and just tell you 2 short stories of 2 clients that I'm representing. I obviously know the stories of the many other people that you're hearing about, and it's difficult to follow in the footsteps, speaking of the people you've heard before me, and I respect them all a great deal. Their courage and their resilience and their perseverance. Every time I hear Abdullah speak, I get shivers that someone could go through that and speak so well and courageously. So I'm going to tell you the story of two cases that I am continuing to act on right now, and then just close with a couple comments about the theme of today, that is human rights and national security 10 years later. Where are we? Abousfian Abdelrazik, you have heard about his case. Well, I hope the people in this room have heard about his case. Mr. Abdelrazik is a Montrealer. He came to Canada in 1989 as a refugee from Sudan. He was approved as a refugee and became a Canadian citizen in 1995. In 2003, he, for the first time, returned to Sudan to visit family. And there, he was detained by the Sudanese National Security Intelligence Agency. He spent 3 years in detention in the worst prisons of Khartoum and Sudan. And on his release in 2006, he found that he was barred from returning to Canada. The Canadian government would not give him his passport, and he was told that no airline would carry him because he had now been placed on the United Nations no-fly list. Those are difficult times, unimaginably difficult times for Mr. Abdelrazik. He not only had been branded internationally as a terrorist by the United Nations Security Council, but also he had been separated from his children in Canada. His first wife had died of cancer a year before he left, and his young children were left in Montreal without him. It was a very, very terrible time. As many of you may know, we brought a court application in 2008, ultimately heard and won in 2009, ordering Canada to return Mr. Abdelrazik to Canada by any means. In the course of that year, we had been able to secure a plane ticket for him to come home, but Canada still refused to provide him with a passport and continued to say that he was a national security threat to Canada. He lived for a year in the reception area of Canada's embassy in Khartoum, in very difficult circumstances, as his own mental health and physical health deteriorated even further. But ultimately, we won. We won partway anyway. We got a court to rule that Canada had violated his human rights and that he should be returned to Montreal and his family by any means. In the course of that case, we also received a lot of documentation that confirmed what we had suspected, and that is that the Canadian Security Intelligence Service had asked the Sudanese to detain him, to keep him in detention. And it was also quite shocking in many ways to see some of the communications back and forth between the Sudanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Canadian Foreign Affairs, where the Sudanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs were lecturing Canada, saying, you know, we can't keep holding him for you. This is a violation of human rights. Ultimately, in 2006, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sudan was telling Canada that they were worried that they could no longer protect Mr. Abdelrazik from the National Security Intelligence Service of Sudan, and that if Canada could not arrange for him to be returned to Canada immediately, they were deeply worried, that is, the Sudanese were deeply worried, that the security intelligence would find a final solution for him. Fortunately, Mr. Abdelrazik, not by the willingness of the Government of Canada or the action of the Government of Canada, was released in 2006 to Khartoum, but unfortunately it took till 2009 for him to come back. We've also brought a lawsuit now, since he's back in Canada, started in September 2009, seeking redress and compensation for CSIS, asking the Sudanese to detain him for his torture while he was in detention for those 3 years. And again, the federal court ruled also that CSIS was responsible in 2009, yet here we are fighting in the same way that the Abousfian inquiry found that Canadian government officials were responsible for the detention and torture of Abdullah Al Malki and Ahmed Al Mahdi and Muyad Nuruddin. And this is the last 2 points in Mr. Abdelrazik's case that I'll make that I think is the theme that runs through this conference. One is that if there's a balance between national security and human rights, and assuming for the sake of argument, one that I personally don't accept, but assuming for the sake of argument that there must be concessions of human rights to protect national security, surely the other side of that has to be that when these national security agencies or our RCMP and national security investigations make tragic mistakes, they own up to it, that there's redress for those violations, for those terrible mistakes that crush lives, that destroy lives. Because what we've seen instead is this culture of impunity, this resistance of accountability. I mean, why did Canadians spend over $20 million on the Abousfian inquiry? For nothing. It was pointless because the findings have been completely and utterly ignored. The judgment of the federal court in 2009 finding that CSIS was responsible for the for the detention and torture of Abousfian and Abdelrazik. Yet here we are in the same way as Abdullah, like litigating these national security cases and civil actions. The government lawyers come up with new things literally every day to stymie us and obstruct us. I wish I could tell you I'd be in trial next year, finally, for Abousfian and Abdelrazik, 5 years after we launched that lawsuit. Pardon me, that'll be 6 years in 2015 after we launched that lawsuit for damages, but we won't. The other thing, though, is the guilt by association, in my view, the racist overtones to these cases. Mr. Abdelrazik repeatedly is referred to in the communications, in the internal Canadian government communications, as a Canadian with asterisks. When Canadian Foreign Affairs or consular officials are saying they might do something to try to alleviate Mr. Abdelrazik's conditions in Khartoum, CSIS objected, referring to Mr. Abdelrazik repeatedly as a Canadian, who they understand he has quote-unquote rights. We all understand what they mean when they do that. And I don't think that Canadians believe that there are some Canadians who are different, who have quotations around being a Canadian. The second case I wanted to tell you about is Benamar Benada. And Mr. Benada, you might not have heard about as much. His story hasn't been in the press as much, but I encourage you to Google it to get more details. But just give you the brief outline of Mr. Benada's case. Benamar Benada was an Algerian who went to the United States in 2001 as a member of the Algerian military for maneuvers. He went AWOL and fled the Algerian military and the U.S. military base and fled to Canada to claim refugee status here. He did not want to be a part of the Algerian military. He did not like the things that the Algerian military was involved with, and he thought that he could find safe haven in Canada, knowing full well that now having gone AWOL from the Algerian military meant certain imprisonment and torture if he was returned to that country. He entered Canada on September 5th, 2001, and made his refugee claim at the border of Niagara Falls. He was put in detention to confirm his identity, which is normal process for refugee claimants. His misfortune, though, was that while he was in that detention, 9/11 happened. He was completely unaware of that, but on the next day, September 12th, 2 Canadian officials came in, asked him a few more questions, found out that he knew something about planes. He had an aeronautics degree while he was in the Algerian military, and there they had it, an Arab who knows something about planes. That was sufficient, and they contacted the Americans, the FBI, and later that night, without any further ado, due process, rights to counsel, and let's not even talk about the Immigration Act, the Extradition Act, or anything like that. They simply bundled him into the back of a car, drove him across the border, and put him in the hands of the FBI. Mr. Abdelrazik was immediately whisked to Brooklyn, the Metropolitan Detention Center, where Maher Arar was detained for a while. He was held in solitary confinement with 24 hours lighting, sleep deprivation, woken up every 15 minutes. When he was taken out for his interrogations, he saw that they had written on his door, WTC, World Trade Center, and he was severely abused. Every opportunity the guards had, they would hit him, slam him against walls and door jams. They put shackles on him that were so tight that he still bears those scars today. Chipped tooth, he has cognitive impairments. And he was held in detention in the US for 5 years before finally being able to return to Canada in 2006 and renew his refugee claim. I'm proud to say that he has become a Canadian in February 2014, but we have similarly fought that case all these years, litigating since 2006, trying to get him compensation for what really the government, they have to acknowledge was a complete mistake. They've tried to say that he voluntarily withdrew his refugee claim. That's what their argument was. Even they know that just simply doesn't hold water anymore. But the thing I would just like to close with is, again, people who are wrongfully accused in these national security investigations are so outside the law. They're so denied rights. They're so denied an opportunity to show, as with Mohammed Harkat, Abdullah Al Malki, that they did not do anything wrong. Yet they are forced to live with not only the horrible experience that they've had to suffer, but the stigma. Every time someone Googles your name, that's what they find. And today in Canada, as we're looking at new bills and new measures to try to safeguard Canada and protect us from these perceived threats, I just caution us all to look back and say that we have not even owned up or understood the mistakes, the excesses, the misguided actions, and the rationalizations that government tries to tell itself. If we can't own up to the mistakes in the last 10 years in national security and human rights, how can we move forward? So just like to leave that with you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Due to the fine examples set by these panelists, we have a nice bit of time, about a little over 15 minutes, for questions. There are 2 microphones in the room, one sort of halfway down the hallway in the middle section, one at the beginning of the second section. If you can just start heading to the mics, and we'll just go from one to the other. I'm sure someone has a question. I see a lot of people moving. Oh, there we go. Okay. I will just wait for the second mic to be adjusted there, yeah.
I'd like to thank the panelists here today, and I had a question for Abdullah. After all that you had been through, and an inquiry was announced to be chaired by a former Supreme Court judge, what was it like for you to be denied a single moment's participation in the secret inquiry into the role of Canadian officials in your torture?
It was extremely frustrating. We fought it. We tried to fight it over the course of the inquiry. But it was, it denied me not only the participation, it denied me part of the redress that I believe Ahmed Muayyad, who's here with us today, and myself were, I believe, entitled to. Weren't able to participate in almost anything, unfortunately. But that's unfortunate that happened. If anything, I would say that it should never happen again. In England, they tried something very similar, and eventually it was closed.
I see no one at the microphones right now. So I'm going to ask Dennis a question on the Khadr case. I'm not just doing that because originally I was going to speak on that case, but for a lot of us campaigning on that case, it now looks like really the only way towards any sort of redress is through the courts. And I'm wondering if you can say a bit about the various court cases that are still active right now, both in the US and Canada. And so how many years do you foresee it's going to take to get through those? Because I think we did years and years of public campaigning, and often we get to the courts as the last resort, and there's a lot of litigation pending there. So if you could say a few words about that.
I think a lot will depend upon whether Mr. Harper gets re-elected.
Or you can comment on politics too, go for it.
Just recently we had a unanimous decision by the Alberta Court of Appeal. We had argued that under the International Transfer of Offenders Act, that Omar Khadr's sentence was a juvenile sentence. And the Court of Queen's Bench denied that. The Court of Appeal of Alberta wrote a resounding judgment in favour, essentially saying he should have been treated as a juvenile all along. But of course, there's nothing that we have done or I've done that doesn't result in an appeal. Not a single case. Why? Because the government well knows that I am on a pro bono basis, using my own family savings, and at some point it can't go on. And I'm close to that. And so, of course, the federal government has now appealed that decision to the Supreme Court of Canada. Probably more importantly is what we're trying to do in the American side. We have cases of 2 former detainees out of Guantanamo, particularly Hamdan, who were charged with some of the same offences that Omar Khadr was charged, and the federal court agreed and ruled that those charges laid against Hamdan were not recognised internationally as law of war charges. The very same argument that we had made in over many years in Guantanamo, which was just denied. The problem, of course, is that we can't get into the federal court, notwithstanding having filed our briefs, because we have to start off at the military commission process, which unlike any statement made by our government, who never talks in context when they talk about my client having committed a terrible act, the military commission process is just a kangaroo court. And so what they have done is they've taken our briefs, our applications, stuck them in a closet, and for the last year or so we've been waiting for them just to even rule, just to tell us we're wrong, so that we can now get into the federal court and have the same remedies that those previous detainees. It's not happening. We also have a court application pending to have Omar Khadr interviewed. Omar Khadr has never been interviewed or spoke to the media in his lifetime. You know, just yesterday, for example, I received an email from someone who had said that the Amnesty International's op-ed in the local newspaper resulted in Jason Kenney tweeting a picture of Christopher Spear, whom Omar is alleged to have thrown a hand grenade at, and made some derogatory comments. So we need to have Omar speak to the Canadian public, so that the Canadian public can get to see who this individual is, and not the individual, the terrorist that's portrayed by our government. We also have other applications, if indeed, which we expect that the Supreme Court, what I hope is the Supreme Court will deny that the government's application to the Supreme Court. And then that opens the door for us to then have him moved into a juvenile facility, and then, I don't want to elaborate, and then we will make a challenge to have him released. The problem is that it's going to be a constitutional challenge because it involves the International Transfer of Offenders Act and its interpretation. And so the matter, it just goes on and on and on. And then just very recently, as I alluded to, Omar Khadr, of course, has various damages. First of all, he's blind totally in one eye, and he's partially blind in another eye. And the last 3 months, his eyesight has failed him severely. Last 3 months, has been at 30% of his vision is just blurry. He can't read, he can't see. We've been having him educated, so we're now reading books to him. And all we're going to do at the end of the day is run the clock out at the expense of the taxpayers' money. And then Omar Khadr, when he finally gets out of jail, we'll have to figure out how to assist him to maintain himself as a potentially blind individual. Omar Khadr's story is a tragic story. And when I say to you each and every time that it says so much about who we are, absolutely.
Thanks, Dennis. Really, don't be shy about coming to the microphones. You do, because there is translation and we are filming today, we do need you to come to the mics. But if you don't, I've got lots of questions I can ask. Okay, we'll go to because you had your hand up first, sir. You can go, and then we'll go to the back.
Ladies first, surely.
As you wish.
I want to address that. So I'm wondering in each of the individual cases whether you can comment on how the media has helped or hindered the various, your various cases and your various struggles.
Who would like to take that on? Excellent.
Absolutely, at the beginning, hindered. The media, they were willing to be part of the play of the government, selective leaking of information. They were willing to publish it. They were willing to do all this without any checks and balances. If you go to 2003 to 2005 articles, you would find that I was painted pretty bad. And to the point that one of the reporters, and I still remember it very well, even if after I came back, somehow they did trust whatever the government was whispering, whatever CSIS and RCMP were whispering in their ears. I don't know why they believed it. I think they should have known better, but they didn't. So anyway, that's a short answer, and I'll leave it to, I'm sure others have comments.
Would you like to comment, Sophie? I'm sure you.
I have a...
Okay. Oh, hang on.
Now, of course, eventually, the media did have a good role to play, but it took a very long time and a huge effort to get to that point.
I have a love-hate relationship with the media. They have, as Hilary said in her introduction, I have a background in public relations, and I didn't know I was going to land the biggest PR job in the entire world, which is to defend my own husband of terrorist allegation. The media has been good in a sense that it has made other Canadians aware of the case, and I've had good relationship with many reporters who've done personal stories about us, but they've also responsible for the language that they use in describing people like Abdullah and my husband. Not only is it upsetting, it's hurtful, and these, like, for example, my husband was never charged, but the language they use made him look like he's already guilty of something. He doesn't have any criminal background anywhere in the world. He just passed a criminal background check here in Ottawa. He received his papers, and he has no criminal record. For example, when Mo first got arrested, they had reported that he had been arrested and he had a weapon on him, which was untruthful. And a funny story was when he first got arrested, the Ottawa Citizen had reported that from my neighbors in the building had reported that they had seen my husband carry a suspicious box just prior to his arrest. It was actually our wedding anniversary, our second wedding anniversary, and I had ordered a television that was delivered from Montreal, delivery man, Beau and Martineau, and they were the ones delivering the box. They didn't look at all like my husband, and they were carrying a huge box that was obviously very heavy. But just, the facts are not always truthful. Whatever is covered in the media is not always the truth. And the example I gave of that during my speech is the fact that my husband was the only presumed terrorist in the world to report his passport. When he first entered Canada, he said, here's my Algerian passport, here's my fake passport. The media doesn't tell the whole story about that now, and you read comments below articles that he's using a fake passport, and anybody using a fake passport should be deported. That's what refugees do. And I think the newspapers need to point that out. You're not a criminal or you're not a terrorist because you use a fake passport.
I wanted to say
I just
a word
wanted
or two, and then we'll go to the question down here.
Just say that it's been a bit mixed with the media. On the whole, the media has been pretty positive with the cases I've been working on. But there's one point I would say is that journalistic ethics in this area is something that really needs to be critically examined. There could be a whole day on this, just on journalistic ethics, because what you see in these cases routinely is that the government tries to try them in the court of public opinion through leaks and secret sources and so forth. Like with Abousfian Abdelrazik, when I was just in the last 2 months of trying to get him delisted by the United Nations Security Council, all our submissions were in. The Security Council people committee was deliberating, and all of a sudden, someone from the government leaked documents to a bunch of reporters in Montreal. They were basically shopping them around. Really sort of untruthful, demonstrably untruthful, salacious stuff. The identities of those people still have not been found, again, by an ongoing RCMP investigation. But what was interesting is that some news outlets chose to run it, some news outlets chose to not run it. And so some journalists and some media organizations are very aware that some within the government are trying to create a narrative. And it's difficult when you're representing an individual against the interests of the state. And I think, or when the state's trying to undermine or attack an individual, not in court, not fairly, but through leaks. Some news organizations do recognize that there's a problem there, but unfortunately some don't, and I think it really deserves ongoing discussion and debate, particularly amongst the journalistic community.
Yeah, I think that might be coming up at one of the panels we have organized today. Okay, so we're going to go to the front mic, and I think given the time, just for the people standing behind, those are the questions we can take, and then we'll have to wrap up. So please, in the front.
Very briefly, my question is about, to the lawyers principally, about in these cases where they do such a fantastic job.
Just a little closer to the mic, sir. I think it's all
Right.
you need to do that.
Can you hear it? It's not working. It's all right. Let me try au naturel here. Okay? No. I'm interested in knowing, from the perspective of the lawyers, and my friend Dennis and I have talked about this, what is the situation in contemporary society about resources to take these cases? The cases are talked about as though they are the order of the day, and you end up in the federal court or the provincial courts, and there are these very esoteric and courageous arguments. Who's paying for this? And is there really any access to those individuals like Abdullah and others who have been mistreated in society? How is the profession dealing with this?
Thank you for that, Segru. I remember years ago getting a pro bono award, a national pro bono award, as Hilary mentioned, many years ago in Vancouver. And when I received it, I announced that I'm Scottish, and there's not such a word in Scottish language for pro bono. And there were 200 lawyers there, and I got a standing ovation. But I never got a call, received a call from a single lawyer the following day. Over the years, maybe it's because I'm Scottish and I speak in a more direct type of way, I have been congratulated everywhere, just like Paul. People think we're doing a great job, and then they go home. And you know, I had an experience quite recently close to my house. A former student that I'd had stopped me and told me how well he was doing. He said, "You know, Dennis, I made $400,000 last year." I said, "Oh, that's great." I said, "I don't think I ever made that kind of money anytime." And then he said, and he's the second lawyer who has said that to me, he said, "I hope I never get files like you get." So I see my duty as a lawyer to be more than just to make money. I lecture on it. I lecture about how the law is a powerful tool, and we have an obligation as lawyers to seek out justice for the most underprivileged. But I have come back to your particular question. There's no funding. There's no organization that says, here's to help you. You know, I've spoke for the Canadian Bar at times throughout Canada, and I once wrote a letter asking for funding, some simple check. And I was told that they don't do that. I'm a bencher for the Law Society, and I suggest that we should be providing some kind of funding like that. And I'm told, you know, we're a governance body. We're not a funding body. So it really is up to the principle of the individual lawyer at the end of the day.
Thanks, Dennis. I was going to ask the two people at the microphone, because we're short on time, to both ask your questions, and then we'll have a reply, and then we'll wrap up. So if you could both ask your questions just back to back there, that would be great.
Hello, thank you for coming out today. I was recently at a talk by the journalist Glenn Greenwald, who referred to state agencies such as CSIS or CSEC as a state within a state. So I'm just wondering if we kind of can look on the, I don't want to say look on the positive side, but where have you found areas where you're able to crack or erode this state of secrecy and somewhat hold them to account, however limited it may be?
Thanks. We'll just have the other question at the same time. Let's see if they can.
Yes, thanks, Hilary. My name is Jerry Olson. I spent a long time in Africa and other places working on behalf of the Canadian government in support of civil rights in those countries. I would still like to do that here in Canada. It strikes me as I listened to you courageous people on the panel and to Alex's introductory remarks that the question that we are putting when we question the so-called protections that are put in place in the legal process that stand in the way of human rights, the question that we are putting to people is that we need to put to ourselves and answer for all those people who are genuinely afraid, and while we know that their fear is exploited for other reasons, there is a significant population out there who are afraid and are willing to sacrifice for protection. We need to be very specific, I would suggest, in explaining how our position will make them safer. And I wonder if any of you would like to speak to that. Thank you.
Okay. So if I could ask the panelists each to say sort of a brief reply to either of these questions, and then yes, we will have to wrap up. So who would like to, which side of the table here? Secrecy and safety, anybody?
So just, could you summarize the last part of the question? About how we can...
in our discourse, do we, for the people who are having that sort of fear up, how do we assure them that this approach does lead to safety? I think that's a very short version of that.
The Canadian public, how do we persuade them that human rights? Well, I mean, it's really unfortunate. You know, Dennis, I think, hints at it in many ways that unfortunately we see some of these cases exploited for political gain. I think Omar Khadr's case is the most flagrant example of that, where it's being used as a wedge issue by our current federal government, which I just find like so appalling. And so that clouds things, right? That makes it difficult to have those open discussions about well, what measures would realistically stop someone who is mentally unstable and then just runs across the lawn with with a rifle. I mean, what are you going to do about that? What laws are going to stop that? And you can try to wave your arms and make people fearful to justify other things. But I mean, if you look at the crimes, like our criminal laws work. There's the Toronto 18. There's Moham Khawaja. There's the gentleman there who was just convicted there a couple weeks ago. Our criminal laws work, and they do protect Canadians. But nothing is perfect. And to rely on one or two incidents that. Where we weren't able to create a perfect society, to then justify these excessive measures that infringes all of our civil liberties. It's really disappointing. But what we have to do is just keep Keep the debate going. Keep talking about it. You know, yesterday I was thinking about this conference, thinking about, you know, what would have happened if Martin hadn't called that public inquiry involving Maher Arar? Like, where would we be? I'm terrified of that thing. Where would we be? Because I knew that what had happened would have been totally buried by the government. And I was saying that, mentioning to Abdullah, and Abdullah made the excellent point, well, nothing's changed today. And that's true, and it gave me pause, but I will say this to Abdullah, you know, that what has changed, though, is that we still all know, that Canadians know, a segment of the population knows, and we're engaging in this debate. We know the facts, and once we at least know the facts, whenever there's an opportunity of going to court in some way where we can at least uncap it or lift the veil, then Canadians take the debate. Like the Afghan detainees case, we ultimately lost on the legal issue that the Charter does not apply to protect individuals in military custody abroad. But at the same time, through that process, we revealed all kinds of documents showing that Canadian diplomats were interviewing people who had scars on their back from torture. And when the Canadian public saw that, you know, public opinion changed on that issue very dramatically, I think. And so, it's just an iterative process. The only thing that keeps me going is that, you know, is the optimism that, you know, that justice will prevail. So even though it's depressing at times, we just have to keep fighting and talking and speaking about it.
Okay. We could, of course, spend an entire day on each of these panels, but we do have to wrap up at this point. On behalf of the organizers, I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their stories and reflections with us today. It takes a lot of courage to fight back, particularly when you've been accused of terrorism. It's hard to get that off of you when that happens. And I know the presence of all of you in this room means they are not alone in that struggle, and that's very important, so thank you as well.